The Shadows After Surrender, May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders. The guns fall silent across Europe, but the silence is deceiving. It is the quiet that follows a scream, the kind that lingers in the bones of those who survived. Berlin is a skeletal city, its avenues lined with ash and the twisted metal of what was once an empire. Buildings stand like broken teeth, black against the morning sky. Somewhere beneath the rubble lies the heart of the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, the machinery of fear that ruled with whispers, lists, and midnight knocks at the door. For 12 years, their black uniforms and silver skulls made Europe tremble. They dragged millions into basements, boxcars, and cellars from which no one returned. Now the Reich is gone, its leaders dead or captured. But one question remains heavier than the smoke that still rises over Berlin. What happened to the men who ran the Gestapo when the empire they served collapsed overnight? The Allies thought they would find them cornered in bunkers lined up against walls or hanging from ropes of their own making. But when investigators walked into the charred offices on Prince Albrechtstrasse, where orders of arrest and execution once flowed like blood through veins, the desks were empty. The files were gone. The cell doors stood open. The men who had filled the world with terror had simply vanished. Outside, thousands of prisoners walked free from camps that still reeked of ash. But for every liberated soul, there were dozens of captors who had melted into the crowds, shaved their heads, changed their names, burned their insignia, and disappeared among the millions of refugees crossing Germany. In those first days after surrender, chaos was the perfect disguise. To the victors, the Gestapo was more than a police force. It was the living embodiment of state cruelty, the architects of mass arrests, deportations, and exterminations. They were the faceless bureaucrats of murder, the men who made death an industry. Now, in the ruins of their own making, the Allies searched for faces to match the crimes. But the trail was already going cold. Some Gestapo men had died with the Reich, their last moments spent in underground chambers, as the Red Army closed in cyanide between the teeth, a pistol under the chin, the final act of loyalty to a lost Führer. Others fled south toward the Alps, toward whispered rumors of an Alpine redoubt, a mythical fortress where the Reich might rise again. Many never made it. Some did, and some found paths far darker and more enduring. The surrender did not cleanse the world of the Gestapo's shadow. It only scattered it like ash in the wind. Across the continent, Allied intelligence teams collected fragments, a photograph, here a list there, a signature on a transport manifest. Each clue pointed to a vast, invisible network of men who refused to vanish completely. They resurfaced under new identities in new nations, often protected by the very powers that once vowed to bring them to justice. In British and American archives, one name stood out among the chaos: Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, the architect of the Gestapo, the man who had molded terror into an art form. On May 23, 1945, Himmler bit into a cyanide capsule while in British custody. His death seemed to promise closure. Yet in truth, it opened the darkest chapter of all, because beneath Himmler stood a hierarchy of men who knew how to hide. The Gestapo was not a single man. It was 1,000 hands following 1,000 orders, each one signed, stamped, and filed in triplicate. It was a culture of obedience, wrapped in legal forms and bureaucratic precision. The men who built it were not monsters from nightmares. They were civil servants, lawyers, clerks, and officers who believed that killing was merely administrative duty. When the Reich fell, those skills did not die with it. They adapted. They survived. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, Allied newspapers printed triumphant headlines. Nazi leaders captured war criminals to face trial. But beneath the optimism, the truth was far messier. Thousands of Gestapo officials were unaccounted for. Many slipped through Allied internment camps using false names. Others found sanctuary in monasteries' embassies and the confusion of post-war bureaucracy. The systems they once abused now protected them. And as Europe began to rebuild, so did its contradictions. While cities cleared rubble and children played in bombed-out streets, secret negotiations began in offices lit by single bare bulbs. Western intelligence agencies were already preparing for a new kind of war, the one against the Soviet Union. In that shifting landscape, yesterday's criminals could become today's assets. Expertise in interrogation, counterintelligence, and ideology suddenly had value again. So the question that began in the ashes of Berlin would echo for decades. What happens when the men who built the machinery of terror are allowed to become its engineers once more under a different flag? In the story that follows, we will trace the fates of those men. Some vanished into legend. Some lived openly under new names. Some were caught and tried. A few met justice, most escaped it. Together, they tell the hidden history of the Gestapo. After 1945, a history not of redemption, but of survival. The war ended on paper, but for the ghosts of the Gestapo, it was only a change of uniform. Heinrich Himmler, the head who died, but the machine survived. Heinrich Himmler was not a soldier who bled on the battlefield, nor a politician who swayed the crowds. He was an engineer of obedience, a man who understood that terror could be administered like a bureaucratic process, refined through signatures, stamps, and files. To millions, his name meant death, though few had ever seen his face. He was the master architect of the Gestapo, the SS, and the final solution, the cold intelligence behind the machinery that turned Europe into a graveyard. When the Reich began to crumble in the spring of 1945, Himmler's empire of fear collapsed with it. Yet even as Berlin burned and Hitler ranted in his bunker, Himmler still imagined a future in which he might negotiate his survival. He dreamed of approaching the Western Allies, offering his cooperation against the Soviets, believing that his expertise and influence could make him indispensable. It was a fatal miscalculation, the same arrogance that had driven him to believe the world could be reshaped by paperwork and willpower. In April 1945, as the Red Army closed its iron grip around Berlin, Himmler disguised himself in a stolen army uniform and fled westward with a small entourage. Gone were the polished boots, the death's head insignia, the black leather gloves. In their place stood a hollow man, tired and unrecognizable, clutching a false identity card under the name Heinrich Hitzinger. The man who had once commanded millions now begged to be overlooked by border guards. On May 23rd, he was captured near Bremerverde by British soldiers who at first did not realize who he was. During a routine search, Himmler's disguise fell apart. The moment his identity became clear, the weight of his crimes seemed to press the air from the room. Hours later, in a dimly lit interrogation cell, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died almost instantly, blue foam rising from his lips as his body seized and went still. The man who had condemned millions to die by gas had chosen his own gas to escape judgment. But the story of the Gestapo did not end with Himmler's death. In fact, that was only the beginning of its afterlife, for beneath him stretched an intricate web of command, regional leaders, department chiefs, field officers, and legal advisors, men who had internalized his methods and carried them like a creed. Himmler had built a system so efficiently cruel that it could function without him. When he died, the head was gone, but the nerves still twitched. At the top of that web sat his protege, Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo's Department 4, the central brain of the security apparatus. Every arrest warrant, deportation order, and torture report had crossed Müller's desk. He was the executor of Himmler's will, the man who ensured that no enemy of the state slipped through the cracks. When Himmler swallowed his poison, Müller simply vanished. No body was ever found. No grave was ever marked. His disappearance became one of post-war Europe's great mysteries, a ghost story rooted not in superstition, but in the cold precision of a man who knew how to erase himself. In the aftermath of Himmler's suicide, Allied investigators combed through mountains of files seeking the structure of the beast he had built. What they found was staggering entire divisions devoted to psychological warfare, racial policy, logistics of deportation, propaganda, legal manipulation. The Gestapo had not been chaos. It was order weaponized, and it was not limited to fanatics in black uniforms. It had been fed by clerks, typists, trained conductors, and lawyers who believed they were merely doing their duty. That was Himmler's greatest creation, not the camps, not the killings, but the culture of obedience that made them possible. He had transformed mass murder into an administrative routine, hiding genocide behind the veneer of official procedure. His genius was to make evil look like office work. Even in death, his influence persisted. The Allies dismantled the Reich's institutions, but the people who had staffed them did not evaporate. Many were interrogated and released their skills repurposed for post-war reconstruction. Others slipped through the cracks, claiming to be low-level functionaries or technical experts. In a Europe now desperate to rebuild, few had the time or the will to ask whether those experts had once served Himmler's vision. By 1946, rumors began to circulate that the Gestapo's records had not been fully destroyed. Some files, it was said, had been smuggled out of Germany by fleeing officers traded for protection or money. These documents, filled with names, addresses, and coded operations, became bargaining chips in the emerging Cold War. Former Gestapo officials discovered that their knowledge of Soviet activities, real or fabricated, could buy them safety. The same men who once served Himmler now whispered to their new masters in Washington, London, or Moscow. The machinery of intelligence had changed flags, but not its operators. The British called Himmler's suicide an act of cowardice. To many survivors, it was theft. He had stolen the justice that could never be given back to the dead. To historians, it became a grim metaphor. The man who engineered death on an industrial scale had found a way to escape the reckoning of history. But his death did not end the poison. It scattered it into the files, into the names that disappeared from rosters, into the offices of a divided Germany, where men with clean suits and new titles carried the same old instincts. In one of his final speeches, weeks before his downfall, Himmler had told his officers that the SS must remain the eternal order, an idea, not just a force. In a cruel twist of fate, that prophecy came true in ways he could never have foreseen. The Gestapo's spirit, the belief that order justified cruelty, that obedience outweighed conscience, outlived the Reich itself. It found new homes in secret agencies, interrogation rooms, and political offices rebuilt from the ashes. The Reich had died. Its leader had swallowed poison, but its architects had drawn the blueprints too well. They had built something that could survive its own destruction, a network without a face, an idea without a flag. And as Allied soldiers buried Himmler's corpse in an unmarked grave somewhere in a British field, the last trace of the man vanished into the soil. No one was told where, no cross was planted, no stone was carved. It was as if he had never existed at all. But the files remained. The signatures remained. and the ghosts of his officers were already on the move westward, southward, across borders and oceans, carrying with them the knowledge of how to make a system of terror disappear in plain sight. The head of the snake was dead, but the body still moved. Heinrich Müller, the ghost of the Gestapo. When Berlin fell, it was not with a single explosion, but with a slow suffocation. Soviet artillery tore through the city for days, shattering stone and bone alike. In the Chancellery bunker, as Hitler's empire imploded around him, one man remained calm amid the roar: Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, known to his subordinates simply as Gestapo Müller. He was a bureaucrat of death, not a soldier. His weapon was the pen, his battlefield, a desk stacked with files. Yet the orders he signed determined who would live and who would vanish forever. Müller had joined the Nazi movement not out of passion, but out of efficiency. A former police officer, he rose quickly because he understood what the regime required: silent secrecy and absolute precision. Under Himmler's command, Müller ran the Gestapo's Department IV of the Reich Main Security Office, the central nervous system of the Nazi terror state. Every arrest order, every deportation list, every interrogation report flowed through his office. He was not a man of speeches, but of numbers and logistics, a bureaucrat who believed in results. On April 30th, 1945, the day Hitler shot himself in his bunker, Müller was still signing papers. Witnesses later recalled seeing him at his desk inside Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasse. The walls shook from Soviet artillery, windows shattered, yet Müller continued to work. The city was dying, but the machinery of control kept running until the very last minute. That was who he was, the man who made sure the trains to the camps ran on time, even as the Reich itself derailed. Then, without warning, he vanished. No confirmed body was ever found, no reliable witness ever claimed to have seen him die. Some believed he perished in the ruins of Berlin. Others insisted he fled south toward Bavaria or Austria, following the same escape routes whispered among the SS elite. Allied intelligence agents, both American and Soviet, launched massive manhunts in the following years, chasing every lead, interrogating former colleagues, digging through rubble and archives. But Heinrich Müller had evaporated. For decades, his name haunted post-war investigators like a curse. CIA files declassified half a century later revealed the extent of their obsession reports of Müller sightings in South America, Buenos Aires, Cordoba, Asunción, between 1947 and 1952. Each report detailed a man resembling him, small, sharp-featured, speaking fluent German, living quietly under a false identity. None were confirmed, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. It was said that Müller, unlike Eichmann or Mengele, never needed a new name. He simply erased the old one from the records and became invisible. A man who had spent his career vanishing. Others knew precisely how to vanish himself. He had studied human behavior, surveillance methods, and counterintelligence long before such words became Cold War vocabulary. The Gestapo had taught its officers to disappear when necessary, to live off false papers, to memorize alternate identities, to blend into the machinery of occupation and reconstruction. There were darker rumors, too. Some believed Müller had switched sides entirely, that the Soviets captured him and kept him alive for his expertise. Soviet archives released after 1991 contain hints, but no proof. A file referencing a German intelligence specialist detained near Berlin in May 1945, then transferred to Moscow. The trail ends there. If Müller lived, he lived as a ghost behind the Iron Curtain. If he died, his grave was never marked. What makes his disappearance so chilling is what he left behind. His office, recovered after the war, contained fragments of the Gestapo's inner workings interrogation protocols, coded messages, and lists of collaborators. One surviving document bore his signature, dated April 30th, 1945, the very day of Hitler's suicide. That piece of paper became a symbol of the machine that refused to stop functioning, even as the regime collapsed. The Gestapo, through Müller, had continued operating until its last breath. But Müller's ghost was not confined to history books. He became a symbol of something larger, the enduring survival of the system he represented. Every rumor of his escape, every whisper of his involvement in post-war intelligence networks fueled a terrifying idea that the Gestapo never truly died, only evolved. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War divided, the world Western intelligence agencies began to see value in men like Müller. His expertise, interrogation techniques, counter-espionage methods, files on the Soviet NKVD were assets. If he had approached the Americans or the British, they might have taken him in, as they did with hundreds of former SS and Gestapo officers. After all, moral lines blurred quickly in the shadow of the atomic bomb. A 1949 CIA memo released decades later summed up the dilemma. Subject may be of operational use, if located. Experience invaluable in Soviet matters. Capture or recruitment advised. The very idea of recruiting the man who had orchestrated mass arrests, torture, and deportation shows how swiftly justice was replaced by pragmatism. But there was something else about Müller that fascinated those who hunted him. He represented the perfect Nazi not in ideology but in efficiency. He did not scream slogans or revel in cruelty. He simply believed in order and in obedience as its highest virtue. When the Reich demanded extermination, he treated it as administrative necessity. That kind of evil, quiet, methodical, rational is what terrified post-war Europe most. It wasn't madness, it was management. For many survivors, Müller became a phantom that personified injustice itself. Every time another war criminal escaped punishment, every time a former SS officer found a comfortable life in West Germany, the name Müller resurfaced, whispered like a curse. He was the one who got away, the man who slipped through history's fingers. Even in modern Germany, the question still lingers in archives and documentaries. Where did Heinrich Müller go? Some forensic teams in the 1960s claim to have found his remains near the Chancellery, but DNA testing decades later disproved it. Others point to evidence that he escaped through the Vatican Ratlines, reaching South America as early as 1948. None of it has been proven. His story remains open-ended, and perhaps that is why it endures. Müller's ghost is more than the mystery of one man's fate. It is the story of how a system of terror can outlast the regime that created it. The Gestapo's files were destroyed, but its methods lived on in interrogations and surveillance, in the logic of state secrecy that spread across both sides of the Iron Curtain. Müller was the bridge between the old order and the new world of intelligence and counterintelligence. The man who once decided who would disappear taught the world how to disappear. And so, as the years passed and new wars began, his name faded from the headlines, but not from the soil. In Berlin, during construction of new government buildings decades later, workers unearthed the ruins of the old Gestapo headquarters. Beneath the foundations lay fragments of burned documents, some still bearing signatures beginning with an H. No one can say with certainty whose they were, but the irony lingers even in ashes. His handwriting survived longer than justice itself. Heinrich Müller, the bureaucrat of fear, the ghost of the Gestapo, remains unburied both in body and in history. Franz 6, when evil became expertise, when the guns of Europe finally went silent, justice seemed inevitable. the world demanded retribution for the millions who had vanished into camps, prisons, and forests. Yet in the smoky aftermath of war, lines blurred quickly between guilt and usefulness, between justice and necessity. Few stories capture that moral corrosion better than the tale of Franz VI, a man who turned ideology into science and science into justification. Franz VI was not a brute or a sadist in uniform. He was a scholar, a doctor of philosophy, a university lecturer, a man who spoke softly and believed deeply in intellectual order. His discipline was not anatomy or chemistry, but ideology. Under the Nazi regime, he was tasked with studying the enemies of Germany, categorizing thought itself as a weapon. He rose to become the head of Department 7 in the Reich Main Security Office, the bureau responsible for ideological research and propaganda control. In plain language, Six engineered the intellectual framework for genocide. He was one of Himmler's brightest minds, a man who could quote Kant while drafting policies on racial extermination. His department didn't handle arrests or executions directly. It justified them. Six believed that the Holocaust was not only a physical cleansing, but a cultural one. He collected data on Jewish intellectuals, clergy, academics, and political dissidents across Europe, drawing up lists for cultural liquidation. He called it Gegnerforschung, the study of the enemy. Under his guidance, ideas themselves became a target. When the Allies captured him in 1945, they expected another fanatic shouting slogans. Instead, they found a calm, educated man who described his work as scientific research. At the Nuremberg trials, Franz VI's testimony sent chills through the courtroom. He spoke without remorse, without anger, only precision. He admitted to drawing up lists for mass arrests, but denied responsibility for the murders that followed. "I was a scholar," he said. "My work was theoretical. It was the defense of an intellectual executioner killing through paperwork and theory." In 1948, the judges sentenced him to 20 years in prison for crimes against humanity. He served only 4. By 1952, he was free, not escaped, not hidden, but released early. His rehabilitation came quietly without press or protest. Within months, Franz VI had found employment with a new organization, the Gehlen Organization, the US-backed West German intelligence service built from the remains of Nazi military intelligence. Its founder, General Reinhard Gehlen, had convinced the Americans that his networks inside the Soviet Union were invaluable in the coming Cold War. And he was right, or at least persuasive enough for Washington to look the other way. The Gehlen Organization became the nucleus of the new West German Federal Intelligence Service, the BND. Its staff lists read like a roll call of the Third Reich's forgotten officers. Former SS analysts, Gestapo informants, and counterintelligence experts filled its ranks. Among them sat Dr. Franz VI, the academic who once categorized ideas by race and blood. He was now advising on Soviet propaganda and psychological warfare, still mapping the enemy mind, only under a different banner. American intelligence knew who he was. They had his Nuremberg file. They knew the details of his conviction, his ideological past, his role in the extermination of European intellectual life. But in the calculus of Cold War politics, expertise outweighed morality. The same analytical mind that once dissected Jewish philosophy was now dissecting Marxist ideology. His salary came indirectly from CIA funds funneled through West German intelligence budgets. The transformation was official. The philosopher of fascism had become the professor of democracy's defense. For Franz VI, the transition required no guilt, no reckoning. His belief in order through control simply shifted targets. Where he once studied how to suppress Jewish thought, he now studied how to suppress communist thought. The language changed. the logic remained. To him, the world was still divided between the righteous and the diseased. Only the disease had a new name. The irony of his post-war career became public decades later when classified documents were declassified in the United States and Germany. Journalists unearthed memos praising Six's strategic insight and psychological expertise. One internal report described him as highly competent, deeply knowledgeable, and ideologically reliable. The words might have come straight from Himmler's office. The story of Franz VI exposes a moral wound deeper than one man's crimes. It shows how easily justice can be postponed when knowledge becomes currency. In the ruins of 1945, the victors faced a new enemy, the Soviet Union, and found themselves recruiting the same men who had served the last tyranny. It was not a conspiracy of evil, but a failure of courage, the willingness to forgive anything if it served the next war. When Six retired from intelligence work in the 1960s, he returned to academia, teaching quietly at a private institute in West Germany. His students knew little of his past. He lectured on political science, on mass psychology, on the dangers of totalitarian ideology. Some accounts suggest he even warned against blind obedience to the state. Those who heard him say he spoke without irony, as if the past had been erased from his memory. He died in 1975, never once expressing public remorse. No monument marks his grave. Yet his story stands as a monument to something larger, the contamination of morality by convenience. His survival was not an accident. It was policy. He was proof that in the aftermath of catastrophe, knowledge can become the new absolution. In 1948, as the Nuremberg judges read his sentence, one observer wrote in her diary, "He speaks like a man explaining a machine, not a crime." That machine, the machinery of rationalized cruelty, was what Franz VI helped design. And when the world rebuilt itself from the rubble, it quietly borrowed his blueprints. The Gestapo had always thrived on information, names, files, patterns, ideologies. After the war, those same skills became the foundation of modern intelligence. The faces changed. The mission did not. The men who had once identified enemies of the Reich now identified enemies of the West. The Gestapo had not died. It had been institutionalized under new management. Franz VI did not flee to South America, nor hide in monasteries. He lived openly comfortably inside the very structures that were supposed to condemn him. That is what makes his story so disturbing. There was no chase, no capture, no disguise, only quiet acceptance. History often looks for villains with blood on their hands. Franz VI reminds us that the most dangerous ones wear ink on their fingers. Arthur Nebe, the hunter who became the hunted. Arthur Nebe's story is a contradiction carved into history, the tale of a man who commanded death squads by day and plotted against Hitler by night. He was both executioner and conspirator, both believer and betrayer. His life, and especially his death, reveal the grotesque complexity of a regime that devoured even those who served it most faithfully. Before the war, Nebe was a police detective, methodical and ambitious, known for his efficiency rather than ideology. When the Nazis came to power, he saw opportunity. His loyalty was not to Hitler's vision, but to the apparatus of authority itself, to order, structure, and control. By 1941, Nebe had climbed high in the SS ranks and was entrusted with a task that would make him infamous command of Einsatzgruppe B, one of the mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen were not battle formations, they were death squads. Their mission was simple and horrifying: to eliminate undesirables, Jews, Roma, communists, partisans, intellectuals. Wherever the German army advanced, Nebe's unit followed, sweeping through villages, forests, and fields. They left behind shallow graves and silence. In the span of 6 months, Nebe's men executed over 90,000 civilians across Belarus and Western Russia. Reports from his unit were clinical in tone, written like business memos. One of them detailed the testing of gas vans near Minsk mobile chambers that piped exhaust fumes into sealed trucks filled with prisoners. 60 mental patients were locked inside during a field experiment. 20 minutes later, the experiment was declared a success. These were the beginnings of the mechanized killing techniques later perfected in Auschwitz and Treblinka. Nebe signed the efficiency report himself. And yet, behind this mask of obedience, something fractured. By 1943, as the tide of war turned against Germany, and the corpses piled too high for even bureaucratic language to conceal, Nebe began to question his loyalty. Some say he was haunted by what he had seen. Others say he merely sensed that the Reich was doomed and sought redemption before it was too late. Whatever the reason, Nebe became entangled with the July 20th, 1944 plot, the failed attempt by German officers to assassinate Hitler and seize power. The irony is unbearable. One of the men who organized the murder of tens of thousands now conspired to kill the man who had ordered it all. Nebe's participation was cautious, indirect, even cowardly. He promised the conspirators police support once the coup succeeded, but did little before the bomb exploded inside the wolf's lair. When it failed to kill Hitler, Nebe's double life collapsed overnight. The Gestapo, his own creation, his own machine, came for him. Within days, the regime launched mass arrests. Nebe fled Berlin, hiding under false names, relying on the same underground networks his victims had once tried to use. He moved between safe houses, sleeping in barns and cellars, hunted like an animal by the very men he had trained. For 6 months, he survived a fugitive in his own country. Then, in January 1945, he was caught. Accounts differ on how. Some say he was betrayed by acquaintances who recognized him. Others that he turned himself in, unable to bear the paranoia any longer. The Gestapo wasted no time. They interrogated him brutally, one of their own, now strapped to the chair he had once ordered built for others. His trial before the People's Court was swift and grotesque, a theater of vengeance. The judge, Roland Freisler, screamed accusations as Nebe stood in silence, his face swollen and pale. On March 2, 1945, he was hanged by piano wire, one of the last executions ordered before Berlin fell. There were no final words recorded, no confession, no plea for forgiveness. The regime he helped build had devoured him, proof that in Hitler's Germany, loyalty was no armor and betrayal had many forms. After the war, Nebe's name became a riddle to historians. Was he a monster who briefly regretted his crimes, or a coward who tried to switch sides when defeat was inevitable? Documents uncovered at Nuremberg show that his change of heart came only after the destruction of his unit, when he realized the tide of war had turned. His co-conspirators viewed him with suspicion, calling him useful but uncertain. The resistance saw in him not courage, but desperation. Still, his story endures because it captures the essence of the Gestapo's psychology, the ability to justify anything in the name of duty. Nebe never described himself as evil. He saw himself as a professional. To him, shooting civilians in forests and arresting dissidents in Berlin were different applications of the same principle, maintaining order. When that order collapsed, so did he. The paradox of Arthur Nebe is that he was destroyed not by conscience, but by the same machinery he once commanded. His own files were used against him. His own subordinates testified to his guilt. The bureaucracy of fear had turned inward, consuming itself in the flames of defeat. When Allied investigators reviewed Nebe's record after the war, they found both horror and irony. Here was a man who could have been remembered as one of history's greatest butchers, yet because he died before surrender, his case slipped through the cracks. He was never tried at Nuremberg, never cross-examined, never forced to confront the faces of those he destroyed. In that sense, he was lucky. His death was quicker than the justice he deserved. But the deeper tragedy lies in what his story reveals, that within the machinery of terror, even the executioners were expendable. The system devoured them as easily as it devoured its victims. In the final months of the war, the Gestapo arrested hundreds of its own officers accused of treason, cowardice, defeatism. Many were hanged in the same prisons where they had once presided over the deaths of others. Arthur Nebe's body was never recovered. His execution, like his crimes, left only traces: a report, a line in a ledger, a note scrawled in the margin of an interrogation file, sentence carried out. No grave, no marker, no memory except in the archives of injustice. He began as a policeman sworn to protect order. He died as a fugitive, strangled by the very cords of that order. Between those two moments lies the dark truth of the Gestapo. It required no belief, only obedience, and in the end, it destroyed both the innocent and the obedient alike. Arthur Nebe's name faded quietly after the war, overshadowed by louder monsters like Himmler and Eichmann. Yet his story lingers like smoke, the story of a man who built the fire and then tried to outrun it. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat of the final solution. If Heinrich Himmler built the architecture of death, then Adolf Eichmann was the man who kept the trains running on time. He never stood on a battlefield, never fired a rifle in anger, yet his efficiency killed more people than any soldier ever could. Eichmann was the embodiment of a terrifying truth that genocide could be executed not with rage, but with routine. He joined the SS in 1932, not out of ideology but ambition. The young man from Linz lacked wealth, prestige, or education, but within the rigid hierarchies of the Nazi state, he found a place that rewarded obedience and organization. His talent for paperwork quickly distinguished him. By the late 1930s, he had been promoted to oversee Jewish emigration from Austria and later deportations from across occupied Europe. He learned to think of people as numbers, their names reduced to entries in a ledger. In his reports, lives were measured in units, quotas, and transports. It was not murder, he told himself. It was management. Eichmann's genius and his horror lay in his ability to systematize the unthinkable. Under Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, he was appointed head of Department Fu B4 in the Reich Main Security Office, the section responsible for Jewish affairs and evacuations. It was Eichmann who translated ideology into logistics. He drafted deportation timetables negotiated with railway companies and calculated the load capacity of each train bound for death camps like Auschwitz-Treblinka and Sobibor. From his office on Kurfürstenstrasse in Berlin, Eichmann coordinated the movement of millions as if managing a supply chain. His signature appeared on documents that sent families from 27 countries to their deaths. During the summer of 1944 alone, he organized the deportation of 437,000 Hungarian Jews in just 56 days, a logistical feat so monstrous it bordered on mechanical perfection. Each cattle car carried 150 people. Each train consisted of 40 cars. Thousands of trains crisscrossed Europe, their destinations marked simply Auschwitz. He rarely witnessed the killings. His job was to ensure efficiency. He measured success by punctuality and volume. The trains must not stop, he once told a subordinate. Every delay means chaos. In Eichmann's mind, extermination was an administrative necessity, a system to be optimized, not questioned. When the Reich collapsed in 1945, Eichmann did what he had always done: he adapted. He surrendered to American forces under the false name Wilhelm Henninger. For 2 years, he sat in a prisoner of war camp, unrecognized among thousands of captured soldiers. But when rumors began circulating that Allied investigators were closing in on senior Gestapo officers, Eichmann fled. In 1947, he escaped from the camp and vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. By 1950, with the help of sympathetic clerics in Austria and Italy, Eichmann obtained false papers through the Vatican Ratlines, the underground network that smuggled Nazi fugitives to South America. Under the name Ricardo Clement, he boarded a ship from Genoa to Buenos Aires, Argentina. There, he found a new life among the growing community of expatriate Germans who had fled justice. Some were former SS men, others simply opportunists. In Argentina, no one asked questions. Money, silence, and connections could buy freedom. For 15 years, Eichmann lived as a ghost in plain sight. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory, lived in a modest house, raised a family, and took evening walks through the quiet suburbs of Buenos Aires. To his neighbors, he was polite but distant, a man who spoke little of the past. To those who knew his real identity, he was a living relic of a war everyone wanted to forget. But memory has its own persistence. Survivors who had lost families recognized the name, if not the face. The trail of rumors led across continents until it reached the ears of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. For years, their agents had hunted Nazi war criminals who had escaped the courts of Nuremberg. In 1960, they received confirmation Ricardo Clement was indeed Adolf Eichmann. The hunter became the hunted. On the evening of May 11, 1960, Eichmann stepped off a bus on Garibaldi Street after finishing work. As he walked home, a car pulled up beside him. 3 men leapt out, wrestled him to the ground, and forced him inside. For 8 days, he was held in a safe house, interrogated, and then smuggled aboard an Israeli plane under sedation. The operation was called Operation Finale. The man who had sent millions to their deaths was finally captured alive. When his trial began in Jerusalem on April 11, 1961, the world watched. Survivors filled the courtroom. Cameras rolled for the first time in history to record a trial of this scale. The judges faced not a snarling fanatic, but a quiet, bespectacled man who sat behind glass, expressionless, answering questions in a monotone voice. When asked about his role in the Holocaust, he replied, "I obeyed orders." It was not rage that defined him, but emptiness. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial for The New Yorker, described it as the banality of evil, the terrifying ordinariness of a man who had organized mass murder without hatred simply by following procedure. Eichmann saw himself not as a killer, but as a bureaucrat caught in history's machinery. He insisted that he was not responsible, that he had never personally harmed anyone, that he was merely a cog in a great machine. The court rejected his defense. On December 15, 1961, Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. 6 months later, on June 1, 1962, he was hanged. His final words were reportedly calm, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. I shall not forget them." His ashes were scattered at sea beyond Israel's territorial waters so that no trace of him could ever touch its soil. For Israel, it was justice. For the world, it was a warning. Eichmann's trial forced nations to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always appear as madness or hatred. Sometimes it looks like efficiency, loyalty, and obedience. It wears glasses, files, reports, and keeps to schedules. Eichmann's legacy haunts every discussion of complicity. His name became shorthand for the bureaucratic executioner, the man who murders through paperwork. And yet his trial also revealed another disturbing fact, that for every Eichmann caught, hundreds of others had escaped. Many of his colleagues from Department Fru B4 found safe positions in post-war Germany or new lives abroad. The machine had been dismantled, but its operators had not disappeared. When Mossad agents returned home, they carried more than a prisoner. They carried proof that time does not erase guilt. Eichmann's capture was a triumph of memory over denial, a statement that even after 15 years, even across oceans, justice could still find its target. But the question remained, how many others had slipped through the cracks? How many men like Eichmann, less famous but equally guilty, were still living comfortably under new names, drawing salaries, perhaps teaching in universities, working in offices, or advising governments? The death of Adolf Eichmann closed one chapter of history, but it also opened another, the search for those who had evaded the reckoning he could not. His trial proved that evil could be ordinary. The years that followed would prove that it could also be practical, useful, even employable. The bureaucrat of death was gone. But the bureaucracy of survival, the network that protected and absorbed his kind, was just beginning to reveal itself. Werner best when law became a weapon. If Eichmann made murder efficient, Werner best made it legal. He was the man who translated terror into statutes, who turned dictatorship into an act of law. His weapon was not a rifle or a gas chamber, it was language. Through his pen, the machinery of oppression gained the appearance of legitimacy. In Best's world, tyranny had footnotes, and death wore the robes of jurisprudence. Before the war, Werner Best had been a lawyer, a gifted one. Born in Darmstadt in 1903, he studied constitutional law and wrote scholarly essays on the authority of the state. His brilliance was cold and mathematical. He believed that order was sacred, that chaos was the only true crime. To him, democracy was weakness disguised as morality. When Hitler came to power, Best saw not madness but logic, a regime that would finally align law with power. By 1933, at only 30 years old, Best was already one of the sharpest minds in the new SS administration. He helped craft the decree for the protection of people, and state issued just weeks after the Reichstag fire. The decree suspended civil liberties, indefinitely freedom of speech, assembly privacy, and due process. It allowed arrest without warrant, imprisonment without trial, and execution without legal appeal. With a single piece of paper, the Weimar Constitution was gutted. The Nazi police state was born. Best's brilliance lay in the way he cloaked cruelty in procedure. He argued that law must serve the life of the nation, and that any act preserving the state's unity was inherently legal. His language was precise, sterile, terrifyingly rational. He called the concept Schutzhaft, protective custody. In practice, it meant arresting anyone deemed a threat to Nazi ideology. Under this doctrine, millions were sent to camps, all perfectly lawful. The Gestapo's interrogations, deportations, and executions were shielded by his decrees. He gave tyranny a legal vocabulary. But Werner Best's reach extended beyond Germany. In 1942, he was appointed Reich Plenipotentiary for occupied Denmark, effectively the highest civilian authority in the country. His task was to keep Denmark productive and compliant under German rule, a role that required both diplomacy and intimidation. Best balanced both with the same bureaucratic detachment he had shown in Berlin. Danish factories produced supplies for the German army. Danish police cooperated with the Gestapo. He ruled with calm precision, avoiding overt brutality not out of mercy, but strategy. Then, in October 1943, he issued one of the most infamous orders of his career, the arrest and deportation of Denmark's Jewish population. Approximately 8,000 Jews were targeted for roundup and transport to Auschwitz. It was a logistical operation similar to those managed by Eichmann, and Best signed the order himself. But this time, the machinery faltered. Danish citizens warned in advance mobilized in an extraordinary act of collective resistance. Fishermen ferried more than 7,000 Jews across the Øresund Strait to neutral Sweden. Only 472 were captured. It was one of the few successful mass rescues of the Holocaust, and Best's failure became an unintentional act of salvation. When the war ended, the Allies captured him and brought him before the Nuremberg tribunals. To prosecutors, Best represented something different from the uniformed executioners. He was the philosopher of totalitarianism, the man who built the legal scaffolding around genocide. Yet in court, he portrayed himself as a moderate, a civil servant who had tried to restrain SS excesses. He claimed he had quietly helped the Danish rescue effort, presenting himself as a man trapped between duty and conscience. His testimony was eloquent, self-assured, and fatally persuasive. In 1948, he was sentenced to death for war crimes. But within 3 years, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and by 1951, he was free. Like so many others, Werner Best benefited from the political tides of the Cold War. West Germany needed lawyers, administrators, and experts to rebuild. The same bureaucratic mind that had once dismantled democracy was now considered an asset in preserving it. He returned quietly to civilian life, working as an attorney in Düsseldorf. Clients came and went. Few asked questions about his past. In interviews, he described himself as a retired jurist. The man who had legalized mass murder was once again interpreting civil codes. It was as if history had folded neatly over his crimes, sealing them from public view. For the next 3 decades, Best lived comfortably writing essays on governance and law. He gave occasional lectures to conservative legal associations, warning against chaotic liberalism and the dangers of moral relativism. In one of his later papers, he wrote that a state must sometimes act beyond morality to preserve itself. The sentence could have been lifted directly from his 1930s memos to Himmler. Nothing had changed, only the context. Werner Best died in 1989 at the age of 85 in a quiet German suburb. He outlived almost everyone who had stood beside him in the SS. No court revisited his crimes. No historian forced him to account for his doctrines. The man who had written the legal foundations of a police state died as a respected lawyer in a democratic one. His story reveals the most dangerous illusion of post-war justice, that the men who gave orders were more culpable than those who wrote them. Best's legacy shows how ideas can kill as surely as bullets. The Gestapo's cells and torture chambers were built from concrete, but their foundations were written in ink, in decrees that redefine protection as imprisonment law, as violence, and justice as obedience. Even today, his logic lingers. Every government that expands its power under the banner of security, every law that erodes freedom in the name of protection, carries a faint echo of Werner Best's doctrine. He proved that the path to tyranny does not begin with chaos, but with paperwork signed in triplicate stamped and filed. When historians describe him as the legal theorist of the Gestapo, they are not exaggerating. His laws were the invisible bars of the Reich's prisons, the invisible ink on millions of death warrants. He never held a gun. He never needed to. His weapon was the authority of words and the faith of those who believed in them. The Allies defeated the Reich, but they never truly defeated his philosophy. Werner Best's quiet, comfortable life after the war stands as one of history's cruelest ironies. The man who destroyed the rule of law died protected by it. The vanished Kammler, Streckenbach, and Oberg By the end of 1945, the world was convinced it had seen the worst of the Reich's architect's Himmler's suicide, Eichmann's capture, Best's trial. But beneath that illusion of closure, there remained a long list of names that had simply disappeared. No graves, no trials, no explanations. Among them were 3 men whose fingerprints stained the very blueprint of Nazi terror: Hans Kammler, Bruno Streckenbach, and Karl Oberg. Each commanded a piece of the machinery that turned civilization into a slaughterhouse. Each vanished differently. Together, they became the ghosts of a system that refused to die. Hans Kammler, the engineer of oblivion. Kammler was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He was an architect, a man who designed nightmares and disguised them as engineering projects. Trained as a civil engineer, he had once built public housing for the German state. Under the Third Reich, those same skills were repurposed for death. Kammler became head of the SS construction department, responsible for the design and expansion of the concentration camp system. He personally oversaw the building of gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, and other camps. His blueprints bore the cold precision of a man who thought in cubic meters, not corpses. Each chamber was designed for maximum throughput, up to 2,000 bodies per day per unit. He specified ventilation systems to clear Zyklon B gas freight elevators to move corpses to furnaces and ash disposal pits to conceal evidence. Kammler's architectural genius industrialized murder. By 1944, he was entrusted with even greater power managing the V-2 rocket program after the death of General Walter Dornberger. Under Kammler's oversight, slave laborers from concentration camps built Germany's wonder weapons in underground tunnels at Mittelbau-Dora. The V-2 rocket, later celebrated as a marvel of technology, was baptized in human suffering. Thousands died in its production, their bodies buried in the concrete foundations. In April 1945, as the Allies closed in, Kammler vanished. Reports conflicted wildly. Some claimed he shot himself near Prague. Others that he surrendered to American forces and was quietly recruited under Operation Paperclip, the U.S. program that absorbed Nazi scientists into its military and space research. His body was never found. Decades later, declassified documents hinted that an unnamed German engineer with Kammler's credentials had indeed been interrogated by U.S. intelligence. Some historians suspect he may have traded his knowledge for freedom, contributing to early American rocket projects before being erased from history's records. If true, it would mean that the man who built Auschwitz's furnaces also helped launch mankind into space. The dual legacy of human genius creation and annihilation could not be more grotesque. Bruno Streckenbach, the bureaucrat of mass execution. If Kammler represented the mechanical side of genocide, Bruno Streckenbach embodied its administrative soul. A career SS officer, Streckenbach commanded Gestapo operations in occupied Poland, where he helped implement Operation Tannenberg, the systematic elimination of the Polish intelligentsia. His orders were clear and methodical: identify all community leaders, educators, priests, judges, and political figures who could resist German rule. Within the first months of occupation, 15,000 of them were shot, the deliberate decapitation of a nation's identity. Streckenbach worked from pre-prepared list called the Sonderfahndungsliste Polen, the Special Wanted List for Poland, containing 61,000 names compiled even before the invasion. The Gestapo's efficiency was chilling. The murders were not chaotic acts of rage, but scheduled operations logged and reported like administrative audits. When questioned after the war, one subordinate described Streckenbach as quiet, exact, and pragmatic, the kind of man who could read a list of names in the morning and dine calmly in the evening. In 1945, Streckenbach was captured by Soviet forces and sentenced to 25 years in Siberian labor camps. He served nearly the entire term, a rare case in which the punishment matched, at least in part, the scale of the crime. When he returned to West Germany in 1955, he was a frail old man. Yet what followed was almost unthinkable. No German court ever prosecuted him. The justification: his crimes were deemed already punished by his Soviet imprisonment. Streckenbach lived quietly in Hamburg until his death in 1977. He collected a state pension, attended local veterans gatherings, and was even invited to speak at police reunions. For decades, his neighbors had no idea that he had once organized the mass murder of teachers and priests. His final years were spent in peace, a cruel irony for a man who had destroyed the very concept of peace for others. Karl Oberg, the executioner of France, while Kammler and Streckenbach destroyed nations, Karl Oberg destroyed families. As higher SS and police leader of occupied France, he became the overseer of deportations to the east. Under his command, more than 75,000 French Jews, men, women, and children, were rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. Oberg worked with surgical precision. His police raids targeted communities with bureaucratic regularity. Arrests every Wednesday, transport list finalized every Friday, trains departing from Drancy camp each Monday. He kept records so detailed that even the ages of deported infants were cataloged. His correspondence with Berlin was full of praise for French efficiency. Captured by American forces in 1945, Oberg was extradited to France and sentenced to death for war crimes. But once again, politics interfered. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and after just 17 years behind bars, he was released in 1962 on humanitarian grounds. The justification was his declining health. 3 years later, in 1965, Oberg died peacefully in his home in West Germany, a free man. His brief imprisonment symbolized the limits of post-war justice. For 75,000 victims, there were 17 years of confinement. For one man, less than 1 hour of punishment per life destroyed. The disappearances and leniencies of Kammler, Streckenbach, and Oberg illustrate a chilling pattern. Some died unseen, swallowed by chaos or secrecy. Others returned home unpunished, living out their days under the same sun as their victims' descendants. The machinery of death had been dismantled, but its operators were scattered like shrapnel, buried in society's soil, occasionally surfacing decades later in declassified files or footnotes of forgotten trials. The Allies, overwhelmed by Reconstruction and the politics of the Cold War, let many cases slip away. Intelligence agencies absorbed former SS officers for their expertise. Governments commuted sentences in the name of reconciliation. The drive for justice slowed, then stopped. The ghosts of these men walked through the new Europe not as fugitives, but as citizens. And yet, the land remembers. During construction in Poland, France, and Germany, foundations still yield bones reminders of how efficiently civilization can consume itself when men like Kammler, Streckenbach, and Oberg are allowed to define order. Each man vanished in his own way, one possibly hidden by American intelligence, one excused by legal technicalities, one freed by mercy that his victims were never given. Their stories converge on a single truth, that the Gestapo's reach did not end with surrender. It merely changed shape, fading into the gray anonymity of peacetime, where evil no longer wore uniforms but suits. The Reich had fallen, but in its ruins, the architects of terror found new blueprints.
Take these.
Ratlines, the Vatican's road to escape. It was not just a nation that collapsed, it was an entire moral order disintegrating in slow motion. Cities burned, armies scattered, and borders dissolved into chaos. In that chaos, tens of thousands of former SS officers, Gestapo agents, and Nazi officials fled into the shadows, desperate to erase their past before the world discovered it. But they did not vanish by chance. They were guided, protected, and often blessed along the way. Their path to freedom would become one of the darkest ironies of the 20th century, a network of escape routes that came to be known as the Ratlines, and at its center stood a symbol no one expected: the Vatican. In the aftermath of war, Southern Europe became the escape hatch of the defeated Reich. Italy, shattered and chaotic, was the perfect transit zone. Allied forces controlled the cities, but corruption, hunger, and confusion ruled the countryside. Ports like Genoa and Trieste were filled with displaced persons, millions of refugees, orphans, and soldiers with no nation. In that sea of misery, it was easy for a Nazi war criminal to disappear. All that was needed was a new name, a new passport, and the right connections. Those connections led astonishingly to the heart of the Catholic Church. At first, the Vatican's involvement was cloaked in the language of charity humanitarian aid for refugees, shelter for those fleeing communism. But hidden within those networks were priests and bishops who believed that even the worst of Hitler's men deserved protection, or at the very least, salvation. Some acted out of misplaced compassion, others out of shared ideology. One of the most infamous of these figures was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric and rector of the German Pontifical College in Rome. Before and during the war, Hudal had been an outspoken admirer of National Socialism. In 1937, he published a book praising Hitler as the defender of Europe against Bolshevism. After 1945, he put that belief into practice by organizing the escape of Nazi fugitives through Vatican channels. His office issued letters of recommendation and false identity documents that allowed men like Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, and Gustav Wagner of Sobibor to obtain Red Cross passports and travel visas to South America. These documents were stamped with official Vatican seals and sometimes signed by Hudal himself. The language was bland and bureaucratic: humanitarian assistance, Christian asylum. But behind every form was a murderer seeking a new life. For a fee, often several $1,000s, Hudal's network arranged transport from Rome to Genoa, where ships bound for Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Santiago waited. Some fugitives traveled by train through the Alps disguised as monks. Others hid in monasteries guarded by sympathetic clergy. The most shocking part is how organized it was. The Ratlines functioned like assembly lines of redemption. A fugitive would arrive in Rome, contact intermediaries, often former SS chaplains, and receive shelter at one of several religious institutions: Santa Maria dell'Anima Collegio Teutonico or San Girolamo degli Lirici. There they were given new names, usually Latinized or Italianized. Klaus became Claudio, Franz became Francisco. Within weeks, they were equipped with travel papers issued by the International Red Cross, which accepted Vatican endorsements without question. Once in Genoa, they boarded ships to freedom: Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, or Chile, where German communities and sympathetic regimes awaited. The Argentine government under Juan Perón was particularly welcoming. Driven by his admiration for authoritarian efficiency and his wife Eva's fascination with European elites, Perón opened Argentina's doors to thousands of Nazis, including doctors, engineers, and military officers. They arrived under assumed names, carrying Vatican-issued passports that identified them as Catholic refugees. Among them were some of the most notorious men of the century: Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death from Auschwitz; Eduard Roschmann, the butcher of Riga, and Walter Rauff, the inventor of mobile gas vans, all found safe haven on South American soil. Not all ratlines were driven by ideology. For some priests, it was business. The Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganović, operating out of the San Girolamo monastery in Rome, charged up to $5,000 per person a fortune at the time. For an additional fee, he arranged first-class ship passage to Buenos Aires and new employment contacts upon arrival. Bank records later revealed regular payments from Nazi-linked accounts in Switzerland to Draganović's personal funds in Rome. His clients included some of the highest-ranking war criminals, such as Franz Stangl, Alois Brunner, and Ante Pavelić, the dictator of Croatia, whose regime had massacred hundreds of thousands. When Allied investigators began uncovering these networks, they were horrified not only by the church's involvement, but by how openly it operated. Yet political reality intervened. By 1947, the Cold War had begun, and Western governments were far more concerned with the spread of Soviet influence than with chasing Nazis across oceans. In many cases, intelligence agencies quietly looked the other way, or even used the ratlines themselves. Some fugitives were deemed valuable for their knowledge of Soviet operations or scientific expertise. In the logic of the New World Order, yesterday's war criminals could become today's assets. It was a moral collapse masquerading as pragmatism. Vatican officials, when confronted years later, denied institutional involvement, claiming rogue priests had acted on their own. But documents and testimony tell a different story, one of willful blindness and silent complicity. Cardinal Giovanni Montini, later Pope Paul VI, was aware of refugee aid programs that sheltered Nazi fugitives, but allowed them to continue in the name of Christian mercy. The Vatican's humanitarian mission had been infiltrated by the ghosts of the Reich, and no one dared to exorcise them. For the men who escaped South America became a new frontier of impunity. In Argentina, they lived openly as businessmen, engineers, even teachers. Local German-language newspapers printed coded obituaries for their fallen comrades. Catholic churches in Buenos Aires held quiet memorial masses for European patriots. Their new lives were not built on repentance, but on reinvention. The ratlines did more than smuggle fugitives. They smuggled an ideology across oceans. In the towns of Paraguay and Chile, new generations grew up hearing stories of the old homeland of discipline, strength, and sacrifice, sanitized of the crimes that had defined them. In a sense, Nazism never died. It simply migrated, sheltered under the cross. The Vatican ratlines remain one of history's most disturbing paradoxes, a fusion of salvation and damnation, where the institutions of faith became the escape routes of murderers. To this day, the full extent of the Church's involvement is obscured by lost archives and destroyed documents. But the testimonies that survive the ship manifests the Red Cross letters. The priest's journals tell a story impossible to deny. When the gates of hell opened in 1945, it was the servants of heaven who held them ajar. In the years that followed, a handful of fugitives would be found and tried, Eichmann, Stangl, Barbie. But thousands more slipped through, carried by the ratlines, into anonymity. Their ships sailed west under false names, their confessions unheard, their sins absolved not by repentance but by paperwork. The world thought justice had been served at Nuremberg. But as the smoke of war cleared, another truth emerged. The road to heaven and the road to hell often run side by side, and sometimes they share the same guides. The ghosts within the hidden Gestapo in post-war Germany. By the 1950s, Germany was rebuilding streets cleared of rubble, factories humming again, children playing in courtyards where bombs had once fallen. Newspapers wrote of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. It was the new West Germany, democratic, prosperous, modern. Yet beneath the glass and steel of progress lay the bones of a buried past. The Gestapo was gone in name, outlawed, and condemned. But in offices, police departments, and courtrooms across the country, its former servants still walked the halls. They had changed their titles, not their beliefs. The ghosts of the Gestapo were alive, wearing the faces of ordinary men. For years, it was a whisper, a rumor that former SS officers and Gestapo interrogators had been quietly absorbed into the new Federal Republic's institutions. Then in 1998, the truth surfaced with devastating clarity. That year, the German government finally declassified the BKA files secret archives of the Bundeskriminalamt, or Federal Criminal Police Office, which had been sealed for 50 years. Inside were over 3,000 names of suspected war criminals who had lived and worked openly in West Germany between 1949 and 1979. They weren't hiding in jungles or deserts. They were police chiefs, judges, prosecutors, customs officers, even politicians. The discovery shattered a national illusion. For decades, the official narrative had been one of cleansing, that post-war Germany had purged the old regime through denazification. But the files told a different story. In the early years of the Cold War, as West Germany aligned with the United States, anti-communism became more valuable than moral purity. Men with intelligence experience, counter-espionage skills, or police training were suddenly indispensable, and who possessed those skills better than the Gestapo. At the top of this quiet resurrection stood one man, Hans Globke. A lawyer by training, Globke had co-authored the Nuremberg race laws of 1935, the legal framework that defined who counted as Jewish and stripped German Jews of their citizenship. His commentaries on the laws guided Nazi judges in enforcing racial persecution. After the war, he should have been tried at Nuremberg. Instead, he became chief of staff to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the founding father of West Germany. From 1953 to 1963, Globke controlled access to the chancellor drafted government policy and oversaw intelligence coordination. He was in many ways the second most powerful man in the country. When East German propaganda exposed his Nazi past in the 1960s, Adenauer defended him, claiming that Globke had been a moderate who had merely worked within the system. It was the same excuse used by hundreds of former Gestapo officials. They were not ideologues, merely bureaucrats. But Globke's role went beyond administration. He had defined Jewish identity for the Nazi regime, deciding in legal language who would live as citizens and who would die as outcasts. Now he drafted the constitutional framework for a new democracy, and he was not alone. The Foreign Office, once purged of Nazi influence, quietly rehired dozens of diplomats who had served the Reich. The Justice Ministry employed former judges who had sentenced resistance fighters and Jews to death. The Interior Ministry, which oversaw police reform, was staffed with men who had interrogated prisoners in Gestapo cellars. Continuity replaced accountability. In 1951, a new law, the 130 Gesetz, allowed civil servants dismissed during denazification to reclaim their pensions and positions if they were deemed indispensable. The justification was pragmatic. Rebuilding a country required experience, but what it really did was re-legitimize an entire generation of perpetrators. By the mid-1950s, over two-thirds of West German police and intelligence officers had served under the Nazis. In the BKA itself, West Germany's new federal police agency, 12 of its 14 founding officers had Gestapo or SS backgrounds. They brought with them not only their training, but also their mentality, suspicion, hierarchy, control. Interrogation techniques from the 1930s quietly resurfaced in the 1950s. Political surveillance files were expanded, often targeting leftist groups or trade unions, echoes of the old obsession with enemies of the state. The irony was suffocating. The same bureaucrats who had once enforced Hitler's racial laws now enforced the Democratic Republic's security policies. In official photographs, they wore neat suits instead of black uniforms. But the eyes were the same disciplined, watchful, unrepentant. The full extent of this infiltration remained hidden until the 1998 declassification. The files revealed that government officials knew about it all along. Memorandums between ministries acknowledged the Nazi backgrounds of senior personnel, but dismissed them as politically harmless. Some files even bore handwritten notes. "He did good work for us then. He'll do good work now." Historians began calling this phenomenon the Second Gestapo. It wasn't an organization, but a mindset, the persistence of authoritarian thinking within democratic institutions. Justice became procedural, not moral. When survivors of the camps filed complaints against their former tormentors, they often faced prosecutors who had once served alongside those same men. The cases dragged on until the accused died of old age, their trials unfinished. Even West German courts reflected this continuity. Of the hundreds of judges who had served under Hitler, more than half resumed their careers after 1949. They reinterpreted the Nuremberg principles with narrow legalism, insisting that obedience to orders remained a valid defense. In doing so, they turned justice into an extension of bureaucracy, the very crime Nuremberg had condemned. To ordinary Germans, the transformation was invisible. The post-war decades were about survival, reconstruction, and forgetting. Children learned about the Reich in history class, but they learned it from teachers who had once sworn oaths to Hitler. Policemen patrolled streets wearing the same medals they had earned in the war, their pasts unspoken. The ghosts had blended seamlessly into daily life, not haunting the new Germany, but managing it. The United States and its allies, fully aware of this quiet reintegration, tolerated it for strategic reasons. In Washington, officials referred to it as stabilizing Germany. In Moscow, it became propaganda, the claim that fascism had merely changed uniforms and joined NATO. Both sides were partly right, and so justice froze. By the time prosecutors resumed war crimes investigations in the 1970s, most of the perpetrators were dead or senile. The few who stood trial often walked free on technicalities. The post-war order had buried its guilt under prosperity. The BKA files remain among the most haunting records in modern history. They are not lists of killers on the run, but payrolls, men drawing salaries, filing reports, attending meetings. Each name represents a life continued a conscience untroubled. They show how evil adapts how it trades its armbands for lapel pins, its slogans for memos. When Germany finally confronted this truth at the turn of the millennium, it did so with shame, not shock. The realization was simple, but devastating. The Gestapo had never been fully dismantled. It had been repurposed, absorbed into the democratic bloodstream of a nation desperate to move forward. The Reich had fallen, yes, but the people who made it possible had survived, not in exile or hiding, but in offices of power. The ghosts were not underground. They were behind the desks of a new republic. The Exiles, Brunner, Wagner, and the men who outran justice. By the 1960s, most of the world wanted to move on. The war was history, the ruins rebuilt, the economies thriving. But somewhere far from Europe, in the deserts of Syria, in the jungles of Brazil, and in the quiet suburbs of South America, the war had not ended. It had simply gone into hiding. The men who had once worn black uniforms now lived under the sun, their crimes buried under new names. For them, the defeat of the Reich was not the end. It was the beginning of a long, patient exile. Among the most notorious of these fugitives was Alois Brunner, a man who had once been Adolf Eichmann's right hand. Brunner had overseen the deportation of more than 120,000 Jews from Austria, Greece, and France. His efficiency rivaled that of his mentor. He personally organized the roundups from Vienna, Salonika, and Nice. His signature appeared on transport manifest to Auschwitz and Sobibor, each train a line item in the ledger of death. When the Reich collapsed, Brunner slipped through the cracks. Using a false identity and aided by the same Vatican networks that ferried hundreds of Nazis to South America, he escaped capture. But unlike many of his peers, he did not choose Argentina or Paraguay. Instead, he fled to Syria, a country then under French mandate, later ruled by nationalist officers eager to modernize their military and intelligence services. There, Brunner offered something priceless, his expertise in security methods. By 1954, he had established himself in Damascus under the name Georg Fischer. The Syrian government knew exactly who he was. They sheltered him first for his knowledge of interrogation and counterespionage, then as a Cold War bargaining chip. European governments occasionally protested. The Syrians ignored them. In Damascus, Brunner lived comfortably in an apartment on Rue Georges Haddad. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, always reading newspapers in German. He had no remorse. In interviews decades later conducted through intermediaries, he bragged about his role in the Holocaust. All of them deserve to die, he said. I have no regrets. But history never forgets its ghosts. In 1961, after Eichmann's capture by Mossad, Brunner became the next target. Agents tracked him to Damascus, but political constraints prevented a direct operation. Instead, they resorted to vengeance from afar. Twice in 1961 and 1980, Brunner received letter bombs. The first blew off his left eye, the second several of his fingers. Still, he lived. His mutilated body became the mirror of his crimes, scarred, half-blind, yet defiantly alive. He reportedly died in Syria sometime between 1996 and 2001, protected until the end by the regime of Hafez al-Assad. No trial, no reckoning, no grave. His body was never found. Justice had simply run out of breath. Another ghost who eluded justice was Gustav Wagner, deputy commandant of the Sobibor death camp. Prisoners called him the Beast. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence inspired instant terror. Wagner supervised the daily exterminations, selecting victims, maintaining order, and personally shooting those who resisted. Under his watch, more than 200,000 Jews were murdered. Survivors remembered his cold efficiency, his constant dog at his side, and his habit of whistling during executions. In 1943, when prisoners staged an uprising at Sobibor and destroyed the camp, Wagner fled. He was captured by the Allies after the war, but escaped from a British internment camp in 1946. Like many others, he found passage to South America through the Ratlines, eventually settling in Brazil under the name Günther Mendel. For over 30 years, Wagner lived quietly in São Paulo, working as a mechanic. Brazil's German immigrant communities provided protection and silence. When Nazi hunters finally tracked him down in 1978, he was living in a modest house with a small garden as if his past had been erased. Asked by reporters whether he felt remorse, Wagner smiled faintly. "I sleep well. The Jews deserved what they got." Extradition requests poured in from Israel, Poland, and West Germany, but Brazil's Supreme Court rejected them, claiming that too much time had passed. In 1979, just months after the ruling, Wagner was found dead in his backyard with a knife wound to his chest. The authorities ruled it a suicide. Neighbors said they heard no struggle. The man known as the Beast of Sobibor had escaped his victims once again, not through flight this time, but through silence. There were others, hundreds of them. Walter Rauff, who designed the mobile gas vans that suffocated thousands, lived openly in Chile until his death in 1984 working as a businessman. Eduard Roschmann, the butcher of Riga, ran a lumber company in Paraguay. Aribert Heim, the doctor of death from Mauthausen, disappeared in Egypt, where he reportedly converted to Islam and lived under the name Tariq Hussein. These men became phantoms inhabiting new identities, living among people who never knew or didn't care who they were. What united them all was not just their escape, but the world's willingness to let them go. The pursuit of justice was uneven, often half-hearted. Nations scarred by war wanted peace more than trials. Governments valued information expertise and alliances over morality. Even the United States and West Germany avoided pressing for extradition, in some cases fearing political backlash or diplomatic complications. Time became their greatest ally, memory their shield. The Israeli operations that captured Eichmann and later Klaus Barbie were the exceptions, not the rule. For every fugitive caught, dozens more slipped away. Many lived into old age, dying in their beds, surrounded by family and comfort. When their names surfaced in newspapers, it was as historical footnotes, not front-page crimes. The world's outrage had faded into fatigue. In 2002, the Simon Wiesenthal Center launched Operation Last Chance, a campaign to identify and prosecute the remaining Nazi war criminals still alive. But the results were meager. Out of hundreds of leads, only a handful led to trials. Most suspects were already dead or too ill to stand before a judge. Justice, once a roaring demand, had dwindled into a whisper. The stories of Brunner, Wagner, and the others reveal the moral exhaustion that followed the war. The world had seen so much death that it no longer knew how to measure it. Each fugitive represented not just an individual failure, but a systemic one, the triumph of bureaucracy over conscience, of political convenience over memory. And yet, there is something hauntingly human in the persistence of their hunters. Decades after the last shots of the war, aging survivors still wrote letters, attended hearings, and searched archives, refusing to let the names fade. They believed that even if the guilty died unpunished, the truth must outlive them. Because if memory dies, history repeats itself, and the ghosts win twice. In the quiet streets of Damascus, in the gardens of São Paulo, and in the files of forgotten embassies, the same question echoed: how long can a man hide from his own shadow? For the world, the answer came too late. For the victims, it never came at all. The trials that came too late. By the 1970s, time itself had become the greatest accomplice of the Gestapo. The men who had built the Reich's machinery of death were old, now gray-haired, respectable, protected by decades of silence and comfort. Most had lived freely for 25 years. Some even celebrated for their service to their rebuilt nation. For many Germans, the war had become a bad dream, something to be forgotten, so life could move on. But for the survivors, the scarred, the haunted, the ones who woke screaming at night, forgetting was impossible. They wanted names, trials, truth. What they got instead was bureaucracy delay and the slow erosion of justice. The early post-war trials at Nuremberg had promised a moral reckoning. They declared that following orders was no excuse for murder and that crimes against humanity would never expire. Yet those principles soon crumbled under political reality. In the years that followed, hundreds of Nazi officers, Gestapo agents, and camp administrators were released early or never prosecuted at all. The Allied tribunals gave way to national courts, and in West Germany, those courts were often staffed by men who had once served the Reich. Justice was not blind. it was complicit. By 1958, a new generation of prosecutors born too young to have fought in the war began to reopen cases that their elders had buried. Led by Fritz Bauer, a Jewish-born German lawyer who had fled Nazi Germany and returned after the war, these prosecutors launched what became known as the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. Beginning in 1963, they summoned former camp guards, administrators, and doctors, not the architects, but the hands that had turned the wheels of genocide. The evidence was overwhelming testimonies from survivors, transport records, photographs, and even blueprints of gas chambers. But the legal system resisted. West German law required proof of direct individual intent to kill, not participation in a system of mass murder. Many defendants argued they were mere cogs in a machine they could not control. The judges often agreed. Of the 22 men tried at Frankfurt, only 6 received life sentences. The rest were released after serving a few years. Still, the trials mattered. For the first time, ordinary Germans heard survivors speak about Auschwitz in their own language, in their own courts. Newspapers published daily reports. Students debated morality in classrooms. The silence cracked just slightly. But as the 1960s turned to the 1970s, the world's attention shifted. Vietnam, the Cold War, and the nuclear race filled the headlines. The ghosts of the Gestapo slipped further into the background. Then, in the 1980s, a handful of long-delayed trials brought the past roaring back. One of them belonged to Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. A Gestapo chief in occupied France, Barbie had personally overseen torture sessions in the Hotel Terminus, including the brutal interrogation of resistance leader Jean Moulin and the deportation of 44 Jewish children from the village of Izieu, none of whom survived. After the war, Barbie was recruited by American intelligence for his knowledge of communist networks. When the French demanded his extradition, the Americans smuggled him to Bolivia in 1951, where he lived openly for 30 years, advising the Bolivian military on interrogation techniques. Only in 1983, after a regime change, was he extradited to France. His trial in 1987, televised across Europe, became a defining moment in the continent's moral history. When the court read the charges crimes against humanity, mass deportation, murder, Barbie showed no remorse. "I did my duty," he said. "I have nothing to regret." Survivors wept as they recounted the screams from his torture chambers. The jury sentenced him to life imprisonment. He died in 1991, unrepentant to the end. His death was not justice, but punctuation, the belated period at the end of a sentence written in blood. Other trials followed John Demjanjuk, the Ukrainian guard accused of serving at Sobibor. Erich Priebke, who ordered the execution of 335 Italians in the Ardeatine massacre. Alois Brunner, tried in absentia in France, condemned though never captured. But for every man who faced a judge, dozens died in bed, their secrets buried with them. In 2002, nearly 60 years after the war, the Simon Wiesenthal Center launched Operation Last Chance, offering rewards for information on surviving war criminals. The campaign's name was Literal Time Was Almost Gone. Its founder, Ephraim Zuroff, called it a race against biology. They identified a few remaining suspects, former guards in their 90s, bookkeepers from camp's low-ranking clerks who had processed transport lists. Trials dragged on for years, some ending in suspended sentences because the accused were deemed too frail to serve prison time. The moral debate became sharper. Should these ancient men be pursued, or should the world let them die in peace? Some argued vengeance served no purpose. Others replied that justice delayed was still justice denied. Survivors, now old themselves, insisted it was not about punishment, but acknowledgement to prove that the world had not forgotten what was done. One survivor of Sobibor, when asked why he testified in 2010 against a 90-year-old guard, answered quietly, "Because I'm still alive, and because the children are not." The tragedy of these late trials was not only their timing, but what they revealed about humanity's endurance and its fatigue. Decades after the crimes, nations still hesitated to confront their complicity. Governments issued apologies, built memorials, and funded museums, but in courtrooms they whispered the same excuses: too little evidence, too much time too late. The law that once claimed to be eternal had an expiration date after all. Witnesses died, documents decayed, the will to prosecute faded. In the end, the Holocaust's architects won a partial victory, not by triumph, but by outlasting their accusers. Yet for all its failures, the pursuit of justice left something permanent behind memory. Every trial, no matter how delayed, forced another generation to look into the mirror of history. The testimony of survivors became the world's conscience. The photographs, the ledgers, the deportation lists, all preserved not only to condemn, but to remind. In the final accounting, perhaps the trials were not about the accused at all. They were about the living, about whether humanity would dare to remember when forgetting was easier. Justice, though imperfect, became an act of defiance against time itself. The judges grew old, the witnesses grew older, the courtrooms emptied. But somewhere in the echo of those testimonies, one truth endured: no matter how long it takes, the dead do not stop speaking. When the scientists of death became heroes of the New World, when the guns fell silent in 1945, the world promised justice. But even as Nuremberg's judges declared that no crime was too great to punish, another kind of tribunal was already forming, not in courtrooms, but in conference rooms. There, in the shadow of moral outrage, a new calculation was being made. What knowledge could be salvaged from the wreckage of the Reich? What value did the architects of war still hold in the coming struggle for global dominance? The answers would give birth to one of the most cynical operations of the 20th century, Operation Paperclip. Its name sounded harmless, almost bureaucratic, but behind it was an extraordinary moral compromise. Spearheaded by the U.S. Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, Paperclip's purpose was simple: to recruit Germany's best scientists, engineers, and technicians, regardless of their past, and bring them to the United States to work on military and aerospace projects. Officially, the program aimed to prevent this expertise from falling into Soviet hands. Unofficially, it was a race to weaponize knowledge faster than anyone else. By the time the first planes left Europe, over 1,600 Nazi scientists and engineers were on the list. Some had worn SS uniforms. Others had used concentration camp prisoners as test subjects or slave laborers. They were not just scientists of war, they were scientists of death. And yet in America, they were welcomed as assets. Their Nazi records were quietly rewritten, their biographies sanitized. A simple paperclip on a personnel file marked that a man's crimes had been reviewed and cleared. It was the paperwork of selective amnesia. One of the most famous of these recruits was Werner von Braun, the brilliant engineer who had developed the V-2 rocket, the same missile that had rained down on London, killing thousands. His facility at Mittelwerk had been built by concentration camp prisoners from Dora Mittelbau, where an estimated 20,000 people died from starvation, exhaustion, and hanging. Survivors recalled corpses hanging from cranes as warnings while von Braun inspected their work. Yet when he arrived in America, he was introduced not as a war criminal, but as a visionary. Within 2 decades, his rockets would carry astronauts to the moon. He became a national hero, his past buried beneath the dust of lunar glory. Von Braun was not alone. Kurt Blome, once Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich, had conducted biological weapons experiments on camp prisoners testing plague and anthrax. At Nuremberg, he was accused of crimes against humanity, but acquitted partly because American intelligence saw his expertise as too valuable to lose. Within a year, he was working for the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, advising on germ warfare research. Hubertus Strughold, another paperclip recruit, had overseen experiments in hypothermia and high-altitude endurance tortures disguised as research. Prisoners were submerged in freezing water or locked in low-pressure chambers until they died. In the United States, Strughold became the father of space medicine. NASA named a library after him. Only decades later did historians expose the truth behind his spotless reputation. There were hundreds of others, chemists, physicists, psychologists, who had built their careers on suffering and now continued them under new flags. The very science that had engineered genocide was repackaged as progress. The Cold War made ethics expendable. The battle for knowledge left no room for morality. The Soviet Union too played its part, launching its own recruitment drive known as Operation Osoaviakim Kidnapping, or enticing over 2,000 German specialists to work on weapons development in Moscow. The same men who had built rockets for Hitler were now designing missiles for Stalin. The world had divided into two camps, but both drew from the same poisoned well. In 1946, President Truman officially prohibited the recruitment of active supporters of Nazi militarism, but the ban was ignored. Intelligence officers simply rewrote the records. Political affiliations unknown replaced SS Major. Military engineer replaced V2 Commander. Justice was replaced by expedience. It wasn't only scientists. Paperclip extended to intelligence operatives, interrogators, and propaganda experts. Men like Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of Eastern Front intelligence, who turned over his files on the Soviet Union to the Americans and was rewarded with leadership of West Germany's new intelligence service, the BND. His network included former Gestapo men who had once hunted partisans in Eastern Europe. Now they hunted communists. The shift was seamless. The ideology changed. The methods did not. To justify paperclip, officials used the same logic that had sustained empires for centuries: necessity. We cannot allow these men to fall into Soviet hands, they said. Their knowledge could save American lives. It was the language of pragmatism, and it worked. Within a few years, many of these former Nazis had become naturalized U.S. citizens. They taught at universities, designed missiles, and led laboratories. Some even received military honors. Their victims remain numbers in forgotten ledgers. But morality has a way of resurfacing. In the 1970s, investigative journalists began to uncover declassified documents linking NASA scientists to war crimes. Families of camp victims demanded answers. How could the same government that had tried men at Nuremberg employ others who had committed identical crimes? Congressional hearings followed, but few consequences came. The defense was always the same. We were in a race for survival. Perhaps the most haunting symbol of Paperclip's legacy is the contrast between two images: the V2 rocket lifting off from the sands of New Mexico and the skeletal bodies stacked in the tunnels of Dora Mittelbau, where it was built. One represents the triumph of human ingenuity, the other its damnation. The line between the two is only a signature, a paperclip on a file. History remembers the victors. It also remembers what they chose to forget. Operation Paperclip proved that after war, morality bends to power. The world's democracies absorbed the knowledge of their enemies and buried their sins beneath the triumphs of technology. The rocket that took mankind to the moon carried more than astronauts. It carried the ghosts of the nameless dead who built it. Von Braun once told a reporter, "I reach for the stars, but sometimes I think of the bones under the ground." He said it with a smile, perhaps unaware of how perfectly it described the world that made him its hero. Justice in the end had been traded for the future, and the future came bright gleaming and built on ashes. The ground remembers. Berlin, 1998. Construction crews were digging near Prince Albrechtstrasse, the site of what had once been the Gestapo's headquarters, the beating heart of Nazi terror. For half a century, the ground had been silent. Office buildings, parking lots, and apartment blocks stood where orders for millions of deaths had once been signed. But when the machines began to claw at the soil, something emerged. Not relics of war, not weapons or medals or helmets, but fragments of bone, human bone, charred, brittle, mixed with concrete dust and broken tiles. The soil itself, dark and heavy, still carried the scent of ash. Forensic teams arrived, historians gathered, and Berlin was forced to confront the truth it had built over. The remains were traced to the basement cells of the Gestapo, where prisoners had been tortured and executed in the final years of the war. When the Reich fell and the Red Army advanced, the Gestapo burned their records, destroyed their files, and left the bodies buried beneath the rubble. The city had rebuilt itself on its own graveyard. The discovery wasn't just physical, it was moral. Every spade of earth seemed to whisper what history had tried to forget, that the Gestapo's power did not vanish in 1945. It was absorbed, repurposed, and scattered like ashes across the post-war world. Its methods had migrated into new bureaucracies, its men into new uniforms, its logic into new ideologies. The war had ended, but the machinery it created, obedience without conscience power, without morality, had survived. In the years that followed, as Berlin excavated the old Gestapo site, a museum was built on top of it, the topography of terror. Visitors walk through the foundations of the former torture cells, reading names, seeing photographs, touching the cold stone where victims once stood. Outside traffic hums, buses, tourists, school groups. The city has grown around the ruins, but the ruins refuse to disappear. The ground remembers. It remembers the footsteps of the officers who once patrolled its corridors. It remembers the prisoners who whispered names through the walls. It remembers the fires that consumed the files when the Reich crumbled, and the silence that followed when the world chose to look away. For every name known Himmler, Eichmann, Best, Barbie, there were 1,000 more who escaped history's pages. Men who lived quiet lives under false names, who died in their sleep, surrounded by family who were buried with full honors in neat cemeteries. Their crimes did not dissolve. They simply diffused like smoke into the collective air. The question that haunted Germany for decades was not only how could this happen, but how could so many live with it afterward? Some said the answer was fear, others complicity. But perhaps it was something deeper, a fatigue of the soul. After so much death, people wanted peace, and peace demanded forgetting. Yet forgetting is its own kind of violence. It buries the victims twice. As the archives finally opened in the late 20th century, historians found that the documents themselves seemed to carry guilt. The language of the Gestapo was chillingly bland. Transferred, processed, evacuated, bureaucratic words masking unspeakable acts. Each page was a ledger of moral collapse, showing how ordinary men could turn murder into administration, how evil could hide inside routine. That was the Gestapo's ultimate legacy, not just its crimes, but its method. Its power lay not in madness, but in organization. It proved that terror could wear the face of order, that atrocity could be managed with efficiency and paperwork. The same skills that once filled concentration camps later filled ministries, banks, and corporations. The machinery of death became the machinery of progress. The world had moved on, but it had learned too much from its monsters. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the city began to unearth its own buried history. Beneath streets once divided by ideology, the same earth held the bones of both victims and perpetrators. In the light of a reunited Germany, questions resurfaced. What does justice mean when the guilty are gone? What does memory mean when those who remember are dying? The answer perhaps lies in the act of remembering itself, not as vengeance, but as vigilance. The Gestapo story is not only about Germany, it is about human nature, about how easily cruelty can disguise itself as duty, how institutions built for protection can become instruments of fear, how silence can be as powerful as violence.